you all for actually quieting down. I usually have to do something dramatic. I want to welcome you all to this year's installment of the Distinguished Archaeology series, started by Tom Lennon in his firm, Western Cultural Resource Management, which happens to be the finest contract archaeology program in the Western U.S. And this is also assisted by the Department of Anthropology and Natural History Museum. So, Kathy Cameron will introduce the speaker.
Well, I'd like to second Payson's thanks to WCRM and Tom Lennon for their support of this event. So it's our favorite event of the year. And I also want to let you know that once the lecture's over, there's a reception upstairs with good food. And so just take the elevator or the stairs right up to the 4th floor after this, and have something to eat, and we can keep talking about what Ken Sassaman is going to tell us about. So Dr. Ken Sassaman, he's the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Professor of Florida Archaeology at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 1991, and he joined the University of Florida in 1998. Dr. Sassaman works in the American Southeast on the Archaic and Woodland period, so you'll hear a little bit about that tonight. He's conducted fieldwork in a number of places: the Savannah River Valley of Georgia and South Carolina, St. Johns River of Florida, and the Lower Swanee Valley of Florida. I think that's where he's working right now. His fieldwork and his theoretical perspectives have been widely published. His vita just goes on forever. He has more than 20 books, as well as dozens and dozens of articles and book chapters, so really interesting stuff. Some of the journals he's published in include Cambridge Journal of Archaeology, Journal of Archaeological Research, Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory, and many more. One of his books, his 2008 book called People of the Shoals, Stallings Culture of the Savannah River Valley, won the James Moody Award, so he's an award-winning author. In addition to his scholarly work, he also does a lot of service for our profession, and he's a very exciting person to have right now because he's the editor of our flagship journal, American Antiquity. So grad students were very excited to see him, as were the rest of us, to hear about how you get published in American Antiquity. His talk this evening is Futurescapes of the Late Archaic, How Humans Dealt with Sea Level Rise in the Long Term. So, fantastic.
Well, thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure and an honor. And I had never been to Boulder before. I arrived 2 days ago late, and spent a little time walking around today, and believe me, it's been a great pleasure. In fact, I decided I'm not going home. Cancel my reservation. Professor Sheep said I have a closet down the hall there. Really is an incredible department, incredible university, an incredible community you have here too. Everything's beautiful, everyone's so nice. Not that they are nice in Florida, but they're nervous. Nervous because you're going to be underwater soon. So the tale I'm going to tell you tonight is an archaeological story. There's a lot of archaeological evidence brought to bear here, but there's a lot of imagination and new ideas as well. And it's the story of living through unrelenting change for millennia. Change that was manifested in a lot of ways, but most conspicuously by rising water. And so the Gulf Coast of the southeastern United States, in this map here, is today, and has been for a long time, the most vulnerable landscape for sea level rise. It's a very low gradient terrain. Hundreds of kilometers have been flooded since humans arrived here over 13,000 years ago. And of course it continues to suffer the consequences of a transgressive sea that we've been told by climate scientists will accelerate by our own doing. And whether or not we had anything to do with it, the evidence is out there that in fact the rates are accelerating or have accelerated in recent years. So the archaeological record out there is very vulnerable. It's disappearing, but it's a record that tells us what it was like to live through this over thousands of years. What I want to tell you about tonight really starts about 5,000 years ago in the Late Archaic period, and that runs to about 3,000 years ago. The record is much longer than that, but the record before 5,000 years ago is under here. It's underwater. And there are scientists looking for that evidence, but it's very costly. And it's high-risk science that, you know, often results in no new evidence with a lot of expenditure of public dollars. So there isn't much of it being done. But the record that we do have, and this land configuration that you see here at this scale, is more or less the way it would have looked 5,000 years ago and then to the present. When we zoom in, as we go through this talk, when we zoom in on these particular areas that we worked here, you'll see at a micro scale how much has been lost over the period between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, and what's been lost since then as well. So it's a long-term story that's been truncated by sea level rise, and I have, you know, the latter end of it that I want to tell you about. Ultimately, my interest here is to develop knowledge, archaeological knowledge, that will be useful for our own futures, and that was the discussion we had yesterday. I'm not going to replay that discussion. Afterwards, if you want to talk with me about it, I'd be happy to. But I really want to show you this incredible archaeological record, and I call it Futurescapes because here's the bottom line. I believe that people who live through unrelenting, noticeable change over many, many, many millennia, which is many, many centuries and many, many generations, have built into their cultural repertoire the anticipation that the future would be different and that they would have good sense at the rate at which that would occur, and they would plan accordingly and not wait for disasters to happen, but relocate themselves, their culture, their people, and especially their past to safer land, drier land, and this happened repeatedly over many, many centuries, so that it became normal to expect change, and they were able to basically adjust without any disruption. They were able to make change seem changeless, right? And life would go on. So it looks like an archaeological record that nothing really much happened, but these people were proactive. They intervened when they had to. They mobilized their social bodies when they needed to, and life went on without being terribly disrupted. So it's a 2,000-year-old story, but I want to start at the end of that story. I want to start around 3,000 years ago with an incredible place that is one of America's best-kept secrets, and that's Poverty Point in northeast Louisiana. It dates from 3,600 to about 3,200 years ago. Those dates, by the way, when you see these dates and they say Cal BP, that means that's calibrated radiocarbon years ago. Just consider it actual years before the present. So 3,600 years ago, calendar years ago, 3,200 years ago, this was constructed. And this is an artist rendition, John Gibson, who is one of the major architects of Poverty Point archaeology. He's a good artist too, so he's done this artist rendition what it would look like in totality. But as you can see, it's a massive 3-square-kilometer complex, 1 million cubic yards of earth. It's 6 nested elliptical half rings, 2 huge effigy mounds, there's one right there, and several conical and flat-top mounds. Began at 3,600 and was abandoned about 3,200 years ago. We're starting at the end because this is the end point of this long tradition of dealing with transgressive seed. And when I come back at the end of this talk to this point, I'll explain what I mean by this being an end point. It's the point at which transgressive seeds reversed, and there was a period of time when they regressed. They went back down, and earth emerged from water and changed the course of history forever for these people. So the story I'm telling you about the 2,000 years, between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, came to an abrupt end, roughly about 3,200, 3,000 years ago, the Poverty Point. Now this site, I'm going to tell you about its construction here quickly, and I can't take credit for this. I've been here, I read the literature on this all the time, I have ideas about what this means, I've published on this, but I've never worked there. So T.R. Kidder from Washington University and Anthony Ortman at Murray State, one of his former graduate students, they get the credit for doing most of the mapping, and it's been incredible. So what they've been able to do is show us the sequence of construction over this 400-year period. It started with the rings, and the rings started from inside out. There's 6 rings, and the rings are divided into 6 segments. So 6 is a recurring number. It's going to recur throughout tonight's lecture in a lot of ways, in a lot of different forms, in a lot of different places and times. So we started with those rings right there. After that, Mound B went up. That's the one at the north end right there. Then below that, Mound E as well as Mound C inside the ring complex. That came in third. And then the 2 big effigy mounds, Mound A and what's known as Motley Mound to the north there. There's Mound A and there's Motley Mound. That's Mound A. Are believed to be effigy mounds, at least some archaeologists think so. They're thought to be birds. The one that was constructed here to the west looks to be a bird that's flying in that direction to the west. The one to the north there, a bird that's flying in the north direction there. So in addition to that, there's one other component here. If you can notice here at the bottom, there's one way at the lower end of this figure known as Lower Jackson Mound, and it's a critical component to the story here because Lower Jackson Mound does not date to the 4th millennium. It dates 1,500 to 2,000 years earlier. It was there in the landscape long before Poverty Point was conceived and constructed, as well as there's Poverty Point, Northeast Louisiana. These other black dots, I'm sorry for the small scale here, but these other black dots as well are earlier mounds, and there are a lot of them in Northeast Louisiana and other parts of the lower Mississippi River Valley that date as early as 5,500 years ago. So mound building goes way back, long before Poverty Point, and this one right here seems to be integral because what we have, of course, is a meridian, a north-south line that connects those 4 mounds right there. We have a second meridian to the east that's about 600 meters to the east, and that connects up Mound C with the Motley Mound to the north there. All right? Now, this triangle is, now I have to give the credit where credit's due here. John Clark at Brigham Young University, who works with Mesoamerican archaeology, he figured out the mathematics of the layout of this complex. So he knows, he's basically been able to infer from the layout of the site what the units of measurement were, and then he makes a very convincing argument that the way this was laid out is basic surveying triangulation. So equilateral triangles used to lay this out. Like such. Now we'll talk about the units of measurement. For me, the important thing here is that, 2 things. One is that it clearly was by design. This wasn't a haphazard assemblage of independent constructions, but there was this grand scheme here. At least it was laid out along according to these meridians. And then the other thing that's critical here is I think that we can infer from the orientation of these mounds and the way that they're in place that this represents, along this meridian, a sense of time and space. So that to the south is the oldest, to the north is the youngest, to the south is the past, to the north is the future. And if we talk about that, we're talking about time-space mapping here, where time can be brought to Earth in metaphorical form in the way that these things are arrayed in the ground. And if you think about things like Stonehenge's instruments for measuring time and movements of celestial bodies, like the sun and the moon and so forth, that can be protracted out over space and used as a way of putting time onto space. Time can't be measured with the human senses. It has to be measured through motion across space or some such metaphorical thing, and that's what this thing represents here. There's one other thing of note here that's critical, and that is that Bill Romaine and other people who have archaeoastronomy expertise have noted that this is laid out according to the solstices. At least that one line that I'm showing you right here connects Mound C right along the margin of the Big Effigy Mound, and then, this is a critical circle right here, to a hole in the ground that was dug right on the eve of the abandonment of the site, about 2 or 3 meters wide, about 1 meter deep, into which were placed 200 to 300 stone vessels made out of soapstone. The source of the soapstone is all the way over in Atlanta, Georgia, and they were deliberately broken, thrown into this pit, and sealed over, and then they hit the road. They left. So it was a closure event. At least we think so. I can't say that. I shouldn't say that so certainly. Right? I've been told I need to be a little bit more uncertain in some of the things that I assert here. It makes for a good story anyway. So this is the end point. I'm going to come back to this, why this is an end point. But here's a little message here. Is this an anomalous, goofy, one-time thing? Like, what were the ancients thinking? What were these guys doing? They must have been on some really weird psychedelics or something to do something like this, right? Or instead, is this basically an historical atlas? And what it represents is over 2,000 years of prior experience. And it was commemorated, materialized in these mound forms. And I think that's the case here. And I think what we're seeing here then is not only a lot of time represented, and of course, going back to this, we certainly have an old element as part of this complex, but this also represents the entire Gulf Coast of the southeast United States. And this was the last major activity in a long period of time of people dealing with rising sea. They ultimately did what they needed to do, which was leave the Gulf Coast, move far into the interior. But lo and behold, after a couple hundred years of doing that, sea reversed, started to go down, land started to expose, and it must have been an existential crisis of grand proportion, right? Just an incredible change in the way that they think the world operated. Okay, so let's go to the beginning. This is the Clovis shoreline. Clovis dates to about 13,000 years ago. It is the best documented early human presence in North America, but it's not the earliest. What came before Clovis is very, very cryptic archaeologically. There's claims for pre-Clovis, but in Florida we don't have any really solid ones yet. Be that as it may, we have the shoreline, which is from where I work now, which is the mouth of the Suwannee River right there, about 250 kilometers from the present shoreline. So that's how much has been lost since 13,000 years ago. That ends up being a tremendous amount of loss when you average it out over the time period. 20 meters a year, that would be about a football field every 5 years. So over the course of your lifetime, a considerable distance lost by transgressive sea. If you were born on the coast during the early centuries of the post-glacial period, you clearly, over a very short period of time, would watch your home flood. And this would have been going on for millennia. It would have slowed over time because this is not a linear trend. In fact, this is a very simplified graph, but it shows two major inflection points. The one being at the time when humans arrived, about 14,000 years ago, the rate of sea level rise accelerates dramatically. Now there's an event I represented here called the Younger Dryas that got really cold for a short while, but would have like stymied this, or reversed it a little bit. We won't worry about that right now. We're talking about the latter end of the sequence. But here we have this major inflection point, and that is a colonization of North America. People arrive at probably the worst possible time if you want to live on the coast. So you arrived 13,000 years ago, might get into a lot of real estate speculation on the coast. Yeah, you wouldn't have been doing too well. But here's the other major inflection point. That's the one about 5,000 years ago when the rate of increase slows down considerably. And scientists across the spectrum have talked about this for a long time. They've written about this for a long time. This is believed to have been the trigger that would have enabled relatively stable coastal living. Not only in the sense that the rate of sea level rise slowed down, and people could depend on these places on the coast being there for a few more years, but also it would have enabled the development of more mature and productive estuarine environments, marsh environments, salt marsh environments, the habitat for small fish, the habitat for shellfish, and so forth. So archaeologically speaking, this has always been thought to be a critical juncture in time when the ability for humans to occupy the coast and make a good living there really, really improved. I think we're actually, there's plenty of archaeological evidence to show that during this dramatic period of change here, that people were living on the coast as well, and they were dealing with it. They just couldn't possibly stay in any one place for very long, not for many, many generations at least. So this is what Florida will look like with a 5 to 6 meter increase, or at least parts of Florida, in sea level rise. And Florida hasn't seen that since 125,000 years ago, long before humans arrived in the Western Hemisphere. But that's what it would look like if the East Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheets collapse. And some scientists are working on the physics of that. It's unpredictable and uncertain, so the big intergovernmental panel on climate change, they don't include these metrics in the expectation for the next century or two. It's too uncertain. But the people that study this stuff at the University of Florida and places in Australia and so forth, they're pretty certain that it's a process already underway, and it's going to be fairly catastrophic. It's not just a slow melt of these ice sheets. There's going to be massive collapse. So clearly there's a lot of loss here, a lot more loss than what we're talking about archaeologically in the last few millennia. This is going to be a return to the sort of accelerated changes that we're looking at in the early post-glacial era.
Is the light blue the outline of Florida? Or the light, I'm kind of confused.
Oh yeah, this is the water. So yeah, here's Miami. Goodbye. The Everglades, marine. You can go to Everglades and get some shellfish. It's not going to be freshwater anymore. This is the St. Johns River Basin. You can enter. You'll be entering from there, from the mouth of it. You can come in from the south if you want now. It'll be a saltwater environment there too. This is the limestone spine of Florida, the white. That's the part that's high enough that you could still 200 years from now you'll be fine there. You don't have any property there, do you?
No.
Okay. So when I go to places like this, is always like a really important. When I talk in Florida, this is always a really important figure. So people are like, "Hey, wait a minute. I think I live right there. Is that okay?" Well, I'm not here to tell you whether you're going to be all right or not. I'm not into insurance speculation. But this is you can find these figures online. These are projections that are based on, obviously some mapping data and elevational data, so they can project this sort of thing. So yeah, the answer is all the blue here is all water now. And there's the outline of Florida. So Florida's going to have some, Caribbean islands. This will be the Bahamas of the future. You can go there for vacation and so forth. I don't mean to make light of it, but it's It's kind of interesting. So listen, here's the only thing that's constant throughout this whole thing. All this change in water, all this change in shoreline, there's one thing that these Native American people could count on. The sun was going to rise in the east and it was going to set in the west. So they knew that was going to happen day in and day out. They also knew that it was going to migrate from the south to the north over the course of the year. That, you know, the winter solstice would be there, and the summer solstice over there as it rises, and the winter set over here, and the summer set over there as it sets. So this is something that is integral to this argument, that as all this environmental change is taking place, they're paying close attention to the sun, or using it as a basis for measuring change over space. It becomes a point of reference that isn't stable. It moves itself, right? But it moves in a predictable way. It's replicated over and over and over again, and it becomes basically a way of calibrating change and using it a way of referencing change. So when you're educating your young people about the movement of the seas, you can reference the sun. You don't have to wait for the sea to come up. You can talk about the movement of the sun as a metaphor for the movement of the water. Bear with me, we'll see a little bit of this more clearly as we get into this. So here's where I work, the Lower Suwannee these days. I also work in the St. Johns River Valley and various other places in the southeast. But we started this project a few years ago in 2009, and this is not a joke. I started this project in 2009 with the intent that it will continue until this landscape is inundated. It's largely National Wildlife Refuge. There's 2 of them. It's undeveloped. There's three municipal, or 3 towns. There's Cedar Key, an old fishing town, the town of Suwannee, another old fishing town, Horseshoe Beach, mostly recreational town there. And none of these places have more than a few hundred permanent residents. Cedar Key is the biggest, and it's an old historic town that goes back pretty far. It was the major producer of oysters, the major exporter of oysters in the late 19th century, the middle 19th century, before the Civil War, to Cuba. And there was a lot of shipping industry and stuff coming in and out of there. So we started this project because we had an opportunity, an investment from a private donor to do a major project that would be something new and different. This is an area that archaeologically is virtually unknown. People worked here in the 19th century. They scratched around a little bit in the early part of the 20th century. But by and large, this is an unknown area. The red circles are places that we've done investigations to date, where we've done field work. The field work is largely locating the sites, doing test excavations so we get samples of paleoenvironmental data, food remains and so forth, but also radiocarbon data so we can get really good chronology of what's going on here. There is, I'll show you the landscape a little bit more closely in actual photographs instead of just these line drawings. This is an environment that is rapidly being impacted by sea level rise, boat wake, and then storm surge. And the storms are actually pretty infrequent here. Hurricane incidence in this area is very, very low compared to other parts of Florida, having to do with the physiography, the movement of air masses, and so forth. This is still, though, an area that's highly vulnerable. So this is a very typical sort of scene that you would see on the Gulf Coast after just a moderate storm. Undercutting the bank, mass wasting of the trees. The shell that you're seeing here is archaeological shell out of a 2,000-year-old archaeological deposit. And so it'll be gone probably, you know, within 50 years. Most of the archaeology that is presenting itself to us today will have gone. So this is, as you might imagine, a salvage operation. And that alone is justification enough, but we have a lot more than just saving these data in mind here in this investigation. So our typical MO is my grad students and I go out pretty regularly. They're always very short-term projects. The logistics of working out here are a nightmare. The tidal range is wide, but the tidal depth is not very deep, so we basically have very little opportunity to get our John boats out there to these islands. We get stranded a lot. If the wind's blowing in the wrong direction, you can look at the tidal chart. It says, you know, you got a high tide at 3 p.m., but there's a wind coming in from the east, and it's blowing all the water out. We've been stuck on islands for 2 or 3 days at a time, eating oysters with hot sauce. It's not so bad. So we did what the Indians do, right? So this is the typical sort of profile, and what we have is a roughly 4,000-year-old layer that was put down. This is an important feature. This is a layer of sand on top of it, and we're still working on the geology of that, but we're pretty sure that this is soil development, not a flood deposit. That's a flood deposit. See that light sand on top of that dark deposit? That's the storm of the century in 1993. A nor'easter came through and deposited a tremendous amount of sand on these low islands and killed some people because it was unexpected and they didn't have enough warning to get out of the way. But we have this deposit here, which is actually what we believe to be a period of time when it was abandoned. between roughly 3,000 years ago and the next layer that comes in roughly about 2,300 years ago. And then there's a third layer on top here that dates to about 1,000 years ago. Nice stratified sites, nice layer cake deposits, what archaeologists dream of for reconstructing change and so forth. So that's our typical MO to go in there and do these stratigraphic excavations, relatively small, collect the data, go back and analyze it, get the radiocarbon dates, and start building slowly this archaeological record of what took place there. We also have these very large deposits of shellfish, mostly oyster, as well as clam, scallop, pretty much oyster though, 99% most of the time. And these things can be quite large. So this is the biggest one in the region. It is known as shell mound, appropriate name because it's a big shell mound. But I'll show you later, but this is a big crescent-shaped deposit, about 200 meters on the side, and it's about 7 meters tall. So we go in and test these as well because these are tremendous records of stratified deposits that go back a few centuries at a time. And they date as early as 4,000 and they continue to be constructed right on through to about 800 years ago. And then this is the ones that's the most risky and kind of heart-wrenching for us. That sites that are eroding actively often contain human remains. So these are cemeteries that are washing out. The 3 that we've worked on, or the 2 that we've worked on, there's a 3rd we know about. They date to about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. They were in place at a time when sea level was down about 1 meter and the shore was about 5 kilometers to the west. So they were in place in high dry ground, but they're now being actively eroded by the rising water and the tidal erosion. And I'll talk a little bit about the one that we salvaged in March there, but this was an exercise in futility. You can't hold back the sea short of putting in cofferdams and pumping the water out. It's a tremendously expensive operation. So we did the best we could just to slow down the energy that was destroying us as we salvaged it. Now there's a god-awful figure, and I only put it up here for 2 reasons. One is to show you that geologists have worked out here. Thank the geologists, because what the geologists did out here was just core the devil out of this place, all these little black dots, and then they did a seismic tracker, looking for seismic structures. And they basically have reconstructed this sea level rise over the past 6,000 to 7,000 years. It's not really fine-grained. It's not detailed enough to say what it was like every century. But it's detailed enough maybe for a half millennium, right? So we have a fairly coarse-grained thing. But here's the other thing that's really interesting about it, is that they were able to document pretty well what this landscape may have looked like at the end of the Ice Age. And what it looked like at the end of the Ice Age when sea was all the way out to the west, well over 180 kilometers at this particular time. It was a dune field of parabolic dunes. That's what all these things are, right? The parabolic dunes form with the prevailing wind pushing that sand in that direction. They get anchored on their distal ends and then they continue to migrate, continue to grow. And this is critical for 2 reasons. Number one, when humans arrived here, whenever they needed to be up off the tidal susceptible land, they had elevation, right? So they were able to go up, these things go up as high as, the highest ones are tremendous actually, like 15 to 18 meters. And then the other thing, this is critical from an ecological standpoint, this is a sediment-starved environment. Very little sediment comes down the Suwannee River. So this ends up being the major source of sand that will enable the marsh environment to degrade and become conducive to the formation of marsh grasses, habitat for small fishes and shellfish like periwinkle and so forth. So ecologically and culturally, these things were critical. So here's one of them. This is the end of one of these parabolic dunes, but it's been incredibly transformed through marine process here. In fact, it's been turned around a little bit. It's just the distal end of it. I'll show you what this looks like in a larger perspective here in a minute. The Clary Key, 2 years ago, was a site, they're all eroding, but this is a site that presented some human skeletal remains, and the local citizens, there's a lot of people retired in this community to go out in kayaks and they paddle around all the time. They reported it to the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, that there were bodies washing out of the shoreline here. They consulted with the state archaeologists consulted with the Miccosukee and Seminole tribes, and the decision that was reached, and everyone agreed, myself included, that as long as it's just a natural process, then we're just going to let them go. They're fine. I mean, that's what the Indian tribes wanted to do with them, and we obliged that. We honored that. Unfortunately, shortly after they were found, a few months later, they were being looted. because they had grave goods. They had spear points and shell beads. So people were digging into them. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has one law enforcement officer for 45 kilometers of shoreline. So he can't possibly surveil this, and they didn't have the will or the technology or the personnel to deal with it. So they went back to the tribes and said, look, you know, this is state land. I know that this is against your will, but we need to get them out of there. And then they'll be repatriated, you know, reburied later. Right? So we went and did that one. And that's what that, you know, that berm of sandbags was that I showed you before there. But, we got in there, we had about 3 hours of work time when the tide was down. Look how far that water is out here. You know, when you look at that image, you go, oh, you got plenty of time, relax, you know. Yeah, the gradient is so low, right? Raise that water just 2 inches, and it's going to be right there, right? So we would watch it come in like a, you know, it's very gentle, it's low energy, but boy, it comes in, right? And so it flooded these things really quickly. We had about 3 hours of work time during the daylight. We planned it so that we had enough time to do it, but to be honest with you, it was really kind of just rushed and really just heart-wrenching to have to deal with it that way. But we got these individuals out of there, and they're now being inventoried for NAGPRA, which is the federal law that protects Native American graves and associated funerary remains. So we went there actually 3 times before we did the salvage operation, and on the 3rd time is when we actually got these bodies out of the ground, these individuals salvaged. The first time we saw 11 individuals, that's these dots here. The second time we saw 20, some of the same ones. 3rd time we saw 22, and then when we finally went back and took them out and we combined all these into one composite map, it ended up being 32 individuals altogether at a minimum. The people that are doing the inventory, they may find other individuals there. Now, it turns out that when these things were reported by the local citizens, they said, hey, this is weird, but it just looks like it's the top of the head. So they presented themselves with the top of the skull eroding out first, and they appeared to be either in a vertical position or simply just isolated cranial material, just the skulls themselves. Well, it turns out they were almost all, with the 2 exceptions, secondary burials, which means that they were disinterred from their original location over 4,500 years ago, and then relocated, reburied in this location. So in addition to that, they do appear to be in some groups, right? So we get these clusters of individuals, and then at least one subset that appears to be linear, that is parallel to the shore face, that they were in place perhaps at the same time there. I won't go into any of the details in this, and I certainly don't show you, I wouldn't show you pictures of these barrels. That's disrespectful from my point of view.
How did you know they were secondary?
Just the skulls, the long bones, the arm bones, and the leg bones. None of the torso, the ribs, the verts, none of the finger bones, toe bones, wrist bones, ankle bones. And the preservation's fine. So secondary meaning basically, it's a term archaeologists use, basically a primary burial is in-flesh burial. Secondary burial is one that could have been processed in a charnel house, could have been put in the ground and then disinterred and reinterred. Any number of ways you could arrive at the same endpoint, but it means basically a burial that was in another location at some point in time when it was defleshed or decomposition or physically defleshed and then relocated. In this case, it could have been very proximate, but I'm going to make the argument that they relocated this from a cemetery that was being flooded, that was seaward, and they brought it landward and put it into a safe location. The same thing we'll do when our cemeteries flood in the coastal environment today. We're not going to let those people drown. We're going to get them out. I think when the Chinese put in that Three Rivers that dam thing, that was the one thing that they didn't account for, was they relocated those villages, but they had a hell of a time dealing with the cemeteries, right? That's a critical factor. I mean, cemeteries are very important, right, to people. We put people in the ground, and people did that in the ancient times as well, for not insignificant reasons, right? That's our past, it's our ancestry, and it's our people. So, and that's why we treat them with as much, we have to treat them with great respect here. And it's one of the reasons why we're going to show you these pictures. They're not my ancestors. I don't have the right to do that. But anyway, there's 2 other places where this happened. And one was documented by FSU back in the early 1990s, before that great storm. They started working on the site, and the storm came and ripped up about 30 individuals from a place known as Bird Island. That's that one right there. There's another place, Cat Island, that has bodies that are washing out. All 3 of these have the same orientation, and they have the same sort of configuration. They're pretty tight, compacted burials. They're not all, some of them are primary. At Bird Island, some were put in the ground in the flesh, and they weren't disturbed, they weren't removed from there, but others are secondary. But they all have the same orientation, the same sort of like configuration, and they have a similar assemblage of about 30 individuals. At least these two are. We don't know about this one in the middle yet because we haven't dealt with it. I'm not sure that we will. They're all located on the distal end of a parabolic dune. There's Bird Island. It's on the distal end of this parabolic dune. This has been transformed to rising water. A lot of this has been reconfigured by that, and through time it will continue to be reconfigured. But they all have that same orientation there. And then this one, which is incredible, Bird Island, the one that Florida State University salvaged in the early 90s, has something that's like Poverty Point. It had a cache of soapstone vessels. Not 200 to 300, only about 15. But these are the sherds from those vessels. Here's what one of them looks like. And this is the source area. Can you guys see that dotted line there? That's the Appalachians, the Summit, as well as the Piedmont, from eastern Alabama, northwest Georgia, all the way up to New England. That's the source of these talc deposits from which this rock was extracted to make these bowls. And then they were exported out as trade items all the way down, of course, to the Gulf Coast and eventually all the way up to Poverty Point in very large numbers. And by the way, they didn't need these because they already knew how to make pottery, and they made a lot of pottery. And the pottery was very sophisticated, very successfully used. So it has more import than just simply utilitarian wear. It was a trade item that had greater significance than the need to cook dinner. So here's the 3 cemeteries, and when I mapped these out about 6 months ago or so, or before that, maybe about a year now, I guess, I noticed they seem to be equidistant. But, you know, in archaeology, you know, when you only have 3, you know, it's not much of a pattern. And certainly this could just be a sample bias. These happen to be the only 3 that we know about. And they're not exactly equidistant because these 2 are closer than these 2 right here. But I started noticing other things. Like, for instance, this one here, McClamory Key, the one that we did the salvage operation on back in March of last year, or this year, excuse me. No, last year. We are due for 2015. I forgot. There's Seahorse Key. It's the highest parabolic dune remnant in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the highest elevation in the Gulf of Mexico. At 17 meters tall, that is a lighthouse today. It was a lighthouse in the 19th century. It was also used as an internment camp during the Seminole War. It was used as a gun emplacement or a military outpost during the Civil War. It's had a lot of historic uses here, but you can't miss this. It's a conspicuous physiographic feature that you can see from great distances, and it's always been an important point of navigation when you're out there in the water. If you're in trouble out there, even in a hazy day, you spot Seahorse Key and get your bearings, you can figure out where you need to be. That happens to be directly south, and then directly north of McClamory Key is the shell mound construction that I mentioned before. There's what it looks like in plan. It's about 120 meters, 140 meters on one side. It's not exactly symmetrical. It's open to the southeast and it has a little sand mound right there, and that is a burial mound that dates later in time. We know this thing was constructed between 1500 and 1300 years ago, so it's not coeval with the cemeteries or the late archaic prehistory that I'm telling you about. But underneath this entire thing, from one end to the other, mimicking the form, is a late archaic midden that dates to 4400 to 4200 years ago. So the shell mound was built directly on top of this older deposit that itself would have been conspicuous. There would have been evidence on the ground that it was there, maybe even small little mounds underneath it. We're not going to excavate this thing ever, but we've done enough testing to know that it's there throughout the whole thing. So, turns out, and this is a fluke of nature, that all the parabolic dunes out there, given the prevailing winds that form these things, are oriented that if you stood on the apex and you looked through the opening, you would be facing the winter solstice set, right? And it turns out that shell mound, if you stand at the apex and looked at that sand burial mound in that direction, you'd be looking at the winter solstice rise. And the opposite, the reciprocal is true as well. If you stood at the opening here and look at this direction, summer solstice rise. Stood here and look at this direction, the summer solstice set. I don't know that this is certainly a product of nature. This is a product of culture and of humans. So this is certainly not arbitrary. And these 2 things complement one another and make the full equilateral triangles, what we could call solstice triangles, which can be used when you have one axis on a vertical line, north-south, to triangulate across space. It's a triangulation method that surveyors used long before we had transits, before we had elevations and things like that. So there's that. So the other thing is that this is on a meridian. That Seahorse Key, McClamory Key, and shell mound make a north-south line. And if I go then and just basically say, okay, if that's true and I'm just not making it up, let's go ahead and put meridians through the other two. Oh, by the way, there's a triangulation with the solstice angles for orientation and distance. Triangulation is a piece of cake. 3 human beings, 2 lengths of cordage, and I can take you on a straight line, assuming there's no impediments in the way, from here to eternity, and keep it perfectly straight. It's very, very simple. You can teach kids to do this in no time flat, right? So let's put meridians through these other ones, and now it turns out they're entirely equidistant, exactly equidistant. So we can lay solstice grid over that using the length of these things, based on the distance between the two, the natural construction, the high point, or the human construction here, and then basically make equilateral triangles from that, later over these other points, and we intercept these things pretty nicely. There's some, there's some mess here. There's places we haven't looked at to see what's going on. Don't know what's going on here. But notice these lines. This dotted line here is based on that geological reconstruction where the shoreline was about 5,500 years ago. This dotted line is where the shoreline was about 3,500 years ago. So it's actually transgressed about 4 to 5 meters over that 2,000-year period. The rate of change now is only about 25 centimeters a century. That's what we've been seeing lately, or before industrialization maybe, over the last several centuries before that. The rate of change during the early time right after the Ice Age was a meter every century. That's the rate of change projected going forward by some analysts. So it was a migration. The solstice angles here factor into obviously time, the change over the course of the year. But is it being used as a way to basically gauge time over space, to have time-space mapping, to use it as a way of calibrating change over time and things like transgressive seas? That's my hypothesis. I haven't worked out all the details yet, but that's my hypothesis there. So the cemetery at Bird Island gives us our best purchase on this right now. There's Bird Island. The cemetery at Bird Island preceded the occupation by about 500 years. The soapstone vessel cache at Bird Island post-dated the settlement when it was abandoned by about 300 years. So we have an 800-year sequence here where these events took place. First the burials, then the humans living there, and then at the end of the humans living there, they come back and they put the soapstone vessel cache in this location. That's a lot of time. It's hard to imagine these things are enchained by memory. The only way I can see that is that there's constant oral tradition and practice that would have replicated this logic, this triangulation, this time-space mapping over many, many generations. So let's go there now. Let's actually kick this up a scale. We're going to go to a higher scale now, right? There's the peninsula of Florida. In southwest Florida, there's a place called Bonita Bay. Bonita Bay is poorly documented, but it's documented enough to know that it's a very large U-shaped construction of oyster shell that dates to about 4,400 years ago. There's not much left of it today, but it's been documented by, this is a LiDAR map, so that's done with their remote sensing aerial imagery. But archaeologists have tested it to get the radiocarbon dates and so forth. Well, there that is. And then here's the one we worked on for about 7 years. It's known as Silver Glen. Jeffries Wyman from Harvard University saw this with his naked eyes back in 1872, and then in 1923 it was destroyed. My former grad student at Asa Randall did a great job of documenting what this looked like when Wyman saw it in the 19th century. And boy, doesn't it look a lot like that. It's set at the same scale, these two maps. These are the only two in Florida that we know of that look like this, and they're pretty much coeval. We don't have really good dates on all of this, but we do have enough dates to suggest that they're within a century or two of one another. Well, this site has oodles of fiber-tempered pottery. It's the oldest pottery in North America. It started to be manufactured about 5,000 years ago, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. It has just a boatload of it, and it's highly ornate, lots of decoration, and it's mostly in this area right here on the apex of this huge U-shaped mound. My graduate student, Zach Gilmore, got an NSF grant to do neutron activation analysis of the clay, and it turns out that half of the several hundred vessels that he's examined from this location were made on clays that came from this area down here of southwest Florida. So we have a direct physical connection between these two things. Certainly they look a lot alike, but the hard evidence is there as well. So guess what? That's on a meridian too. Well, north of that is a place called Greenfield. And Greenfield is very poorly documented. It was a salvage operation, but it's a cemetery dating to about 4,500 years ago. that has a cache of soapstone vessels that date 400 years ago. I dated those myself with soot that we found on the outside of these vessels. So there's, on that meridian, again, this evidence that would suggest these things are integrated at some level. There's one other thing at Silver Glen that is very bizarre. It's a form of fiber tempered pottery that's only found in a handful of sites. It's known as pick island in size. It's got incisions and then it's got punctations as well as lugs on the rim. So it's very distinctive in design. There's only one other place where we found a lot of it. That's at Bird Island with the soapstone vessels, right? That happens to be directly west of Silver Glen, and the angle from Greenfield to Bird Island is the winter solstice set. You with me so far? You ready to have me committed yet? All right, good enough. All right, let's kick it up another scale. This is a multi-scalar project, right? Let's get to the entire Gulf Coast archaeological record here. There's the two meridians we've already identified with our work in Florida. There's the one from Bird Island, which, and I'll show you where this goes heading north. There's the one that connects Greenfield all the way down to Bonita Bay. That's 165 kilometers across, east-west. All right? All right, there they are. And this one actually, we've already talked about this one. If we want to extend it a little bit further, it's going to go to the mouth of the Savannah River, which is a critical junction point between the articulation of populations up the Savannah River and down to St. John's River. That's probably the entry point or the exit point for the soapstone vessels that are coming down that direction there. But we'll leave that alone for now. We're not going to talk about that. But here's another one that's critical. That other meridian, the northern point that I have marked here, is the location of the source of soapstone that was identified by an FSU student from Spartanburg, South Carolina. So it's directly south of where they got the quarry site, where they got this rock. All right? All right, here comes the other meridians. There's one here to the west, 165 kilometers to the west, that links up the Apalachicola Bay with the junction of the Chattahoochee and Flint rivers, and right there is the largest soapstone quarry in the southeast United States, just southeast of Atlanta, Georgia. It's largely destroyed now, but it was massive. The only one that's bigger than that is under Washington, D.C., and that's also been largely destroyed. Here comes another meridian. It links up Choctawhatchee Bay with a point that is basically in the Middle Tennessee River Valley of northeastern Alabama, and that is a location where there is definitely caches of soapstone. They're not well documented, but that is known to be a very important outpost of Poverty Point culture, thought to be part of the progenitor of this cultural tradition in Louisiana. It's a, Eglin Air Force Base is there, so there's been a lot of archaeology done through CRM, Cultural Resource Management, and so forth. Guess what's up here? This is another part of the story I really can't get into much right now. But at the north end of this are burials that are post-dating Poverty Point by a few centuries in what's called the early woodland period. And soapstone vessels occur there over the heads of vertical burials. So individuals put into the ground, oriented vertically with a soapstone pot directly placed over the head. And in a few cases, the vessels were broken and placed over burials that were placed on their side. Be that as it may, that's on a meridian going in that direction too. A fourth meridian, 5, or fifth meridian that connects up Mobile Bay with the junction, the confluence of Tombigbee with the Black Warrior River. I can't tell you anything more about that. We don't have any archaeology in that area to know whether there's soapstone caches there, but these things are spaced pretty evenly, and we do have physiographic reasons why they might be where they are. And then a critical one, at the mouth of the Pearl River in Mississippi, a place called Claiborne, another arcuate shell ring, or shell ridge, that has a cache of 12 whole soapstone vessels that has a line of meridian that would take us all the way up to the American bottom, where the Missouri dumps into the Mississippi, and Claiborne has the only place on the Gulf Coast that has any significant deposit of copper. And the copper is coming from up that system in the Great Lakes, down through the Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf Coast from there. And then finally, the last one, the meridian that connects the largest embayment in Louisiana to Poverty Point, and where Poverty Point has the cache of 200 to 300 vessels there. These are evenly spaced. But without going into too much detail, it's remarkable that these, even though they're evenly spaced, every one of these follows a physiographic scene, mostly water, that makes it highly unlikely that this is just random. This is the Peace River that goes right up to the St. John's. Here we have the mouth of the Swanee, basically going up to the Swanee there. Here we got this river system, obviously, on that seam there. Choctaw Hatchie Bay, not so much. This one's definitely on a seam like that. That one's on a seam like that. That's on a seam like that. So even though it's idealized and it's made stylized, or it's, what would you call, schematic, it's schematic, it actually maps pretty well into physiography that would have enabled people to move up and down from north to south by water, by rivers, right? Things like that. The other thing that's critical here to note is that that's 6 units of space from east to west. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if I'm going to talk about time, the sun being used to map onto space and time-space mapping in order to gauge change and so forth, this is a critical number, this is a critical factor that explains the design that we see at Poverty Point that we'll get back to here in a minute. Okay? We can lay solstice lines on this one, and I modified, the first time I did this, I had an entire solstice triangle over this whole thing, and someone in the audience said, hey, there's a bunch of those intersections of those lines that don't go anywhere. I was like, yeah, I know, and I don't know what to tell you other than I'll just put lines where there are things, and this is what you end up with these solstice lines here. This occurs at all scales, so it occurs at the scale of like individuals who can map on the ground, and it occurs at this macro scale that only exists in my archaeological imagination. So when we get to the end of this discussion, I'm going to tell you, the Indians that did this, the native peoples that did this, didn't see this big map in some sort of urban regional planning design that they put onto the landscape, but this is the consequence of doing this small scale repeatedly for many, many generations over a lot of space and time, right? So it's what you might call, scientists might call it an emergent structure, right? All right, so back to Poverty Point to wrap this up. We got to get back to Poverty Point. We started with it, we're going to end with it. Here's that grid, the triangulation grid that we talked about before. There's an offset here, of course, which encapsulates Mound A. So it doesn't continue at the same increment. It gets offset right here. That's a critical junction point there where Mound C hooks up with that soapstone cache when the winter solstice set right there. I've taken that same logic and mapped it across the meridian that connects Poverty Point to this embayment down here in Louisiana. And what it does is it captures a lot of the earlier mounds that predate Poverty Point by a couple of millennia. Those are those black dots right there. They don't fall in these intersections the way that I would have hoped, but they certainly are in that meridian there. And there's a lot of other mounds that aren't on this map. So to be honest, I'm cherry picking for this part of the argument here, just to show you that. It's a lot more confusing if I put everything up there. John Clark figured out the geometry there. And don't forget, Bill Romaine, Norm Davis, give them a nod for doing the archaeoastronomy. Those guys do the precision work of actually making sure that they have true north, that the angles are mapped out correctly using really high precision LiDAR data and so forth. They did a great job. They did a nice paper here. It was published a little while ago on Louisiana archaeology. But remember, we got that going. Now, so here's the question I have. If we have Poverty Point representing all this time and space, can we actually see it all built into this? And where are the elements that were literally delivered there on the eve of its construction? Like, who were the people that showed up there? What knowledge did they have? Where did they come from? What was their prior experience literally on the ground? And so the best example that I can show you, the one that's best documented at least, is a place known as Claiborne. Claiborne, there it is at scale that you see right there. So it's a few hundred meters at maximum dimension. It's open here to the southwest. It has a little conical mound to the northeast right there. And at the scale right here that I show you here, it is, of course, is dwarfed by the enormity that is Poverty Point, right? That's the site right there at the mouth of the Pearl River that had a cache of soapstone vessels right there at the apex of this arcuate-shaped thing. If you take this site, if I took this site, and I did the wonders of Adobe Illustrator, and just said multiply that 600%, so multiply it 6 times, you get this. It's a reciprocal Poverty Point. The two of them together are like 2 pieces of a puzzle that lock in. The line between the low conical mound and Claiborne, if you draw a line between that and Mound A, intercepts the soapstone cache at the midpoint. There's the mound that was at Poverty Point. That's the solstice line and intercepts the soapstone cache going by the side of Mound A there. This, I doubt, can be coincidental. So I would argue here, again, a hypothesis in need of further testing, that the people at Claiborne had a direct hand in the design of Poverty Point and brought with them their orientation, their engineering calculus, the logic of doing this whole thing when they left the coast for the last time. Now, The rest of the story, we got a few minutes left here, is pretty remarkable, and I can't take credit for this, but it is the story of what took place on the eve of the abandonment of Poverty Point. Poverty Point was abandoned about 3,200 years ago because the people that lived there woke up one morning after a flood and the river had avulsed, which is a geological term for saying it jumped its channel and it migrated, it went somewhere else. So they wake up one day after a major storm and the major channel that connected them to the rest of the world was no longer there. They had no means of navigating by water north and south from their homeland. So they abandoned the place. But they didn't abandon the place, we don't think, instantaneously. They went through a construction phase that basically capped off this history and opened the next chapter of their lives. Well, the soapstone cache is part of that story. There it is. Here's some of the illustration from a publication that was done a long time ago in American Antiquity. It shows some of the fancy ones. They have vessels that have embossed eagles on them, or some sort of raptor. There's panthers. There's all sorts of geometrics and so forth. This is not unlike Mound A, right? So the birds are always critical iconography for Native American peoples. There's lots of interpretation of what that might mean. When you get this far back, it's idle speculation. But we definitely had it represented there. Clearly we have a bird there. It's questionable whether or not that's a bird. But basically there it is, the soapstone cache, 200 to 300 vessels there. Let's talk about this mound now, and we'll wrap it up. Mound A is the second largest earthen construction in North America. The largest is Monk's Mound at Cahokia. This is a massive mound. It's in pretty good shape. You can go to Poverty Point. The rings are pretty much gone. You can't appreciate the construction of the rings when you see it today. They've been plowed under. This thing's in pretty good shape, and the state protects it dearly. In fact, it's hard to get a permit to work, but T.R. Kidder, he's been working there for a long time. He got the permit to go in there and put the first major hole into it. That's an excavation he's doing right there. And then all the black dots are cores that they put down through the mound to get down to the base of it. This is an incredible piece of archaeology. The scale of this archaeology is enormous, but the way he did it without impacting the mound is really honorable. So he didn't have to, they wouldn't let him do it anyway. They're not, in the old days, if there was nobody watching this, he would just, the old boys would have just dug through it like moles and gotten right to the middle of this thing to see what's going on. What TR found was basically that this thing went up in less than 3 months. Second largest mound in North America, went up in 3 months by people that are described by anthropologists as hunters and gatherers. This is not a state-level society. This is not even a chieftain-level society. No leadership that would have been institutionalized, no coercion. It went up in 3 months or less, and TR did a pretty good job. And by the way, he's a skeptic. He's not wild-minded like me. He throttles his imagination. I tend to run a little wild sometimes. He's a good scientist, a good skeptic. He estimates, based on that time frame, 2,000 laborers came here to build this thing over a 3-month period. He also estimates it would have taken another 1,000 people for support staff. So 3,000 people converged in northeast Louisiana at that time. Were they living there? Probably not. How does he know that? He knows that by looking at the stratigraphic sequence. What happened at the base of this mound was that the native peoples that constructed it infilled a wetland. It was a wet part of their site with the sediment, and then they laid a thin layer of light-colored silt, and then they loaded it up with this buff-colored deposit from bottom all the way to the top. The upshot of this argument is that with all the cores that he put in and all the excavation he did, there's no evidence of interruption of the sequence. No surfaces, no erosion, no rainfall, no damage, nothing. Most mounds in North America are stage constructions. They go up in sequences, and when you do stratigraphic cuts through them, you can see the layers, you can see the surfaces. You can say, yeah, that came first, second, third, you can date them and figure out what the time frame is. So without that, his estimation of this thing, 3 months less. And what are they doing? TR's argument, again, he's not given to idle speculation, but I agree with this 100%. He sees this as an intervention, a symbolic, a ritual act that in his mind is the recreation of an origins myth, and the widespread one that gets generalized beyond belief is the earth diver myth. The idea that the world was created when a creature went down through the watery world, pulled up some sediment from the bottom of the ocean, earth was formed, it enabled life, humans, the rest is history, right? It's actually kind of interesting that it's not that different from geological history of the globe. that, you know, gas is condensed, we have a watery world, we get plutonic activity, orogenies, the things that bring stuff to the surface. You know, it happens today. I mean, people have documented things off of, in places like the North Atlantic, the emergence of Earth from water and so forth. So basically, he's saying in this instance that they're reinventing themselves and reinventing their world. And what's going on ecologically at this time, or what's going on environmentally at this time, this is the point at which regression of the sea ensued, sea level starts to go down, and for the first time over many, many millennia, Earth emerges from water. Earth had always been submerged by water up to this point. This is a reversal of a long-standing trend, and these people symbolized it or commemorated it in this act, and then they left. The next millennium in southeast United States is known by some archaeologists as the millennium in question. We really don't know what happened. Between 3,200 years ago and about 2,500 years ago, the archaeological record is incredibly cryptic. Where did people go? One hypothesis would be they followed the coast back out, and now their records are inundated again, just like the earlier people. One argument is that they just dispersed. They gave up any notion of like congregating in large groups and went into upland environments and just spread themselves out. So I'll finish with this illustration. On the right, it's actually the triangulation network of the Rhineland in Hesse of Germany, and this is the emergent property of mapping over a long, long period of time. I don't think, again, that this was an urban regional planning design of 5,000 years ago, that everyone in North America got together and said, hey, next 2,000 years, it's going to be pretty bad. We're going to work it out, guys. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to like get everybody here, and every century we're going to move another 5 or 10 kilometers north on these meridians, and we're going to orient ourselves in ways so that everything seems unchanged. I think instead what we're looking at is micro-histories that accumulate over time to what's called an emergent structure. Why do you have schools of fish operating in unison? Why do flocks of birds look like they're all integrated? Because each one of them's doing what the next guy's doing, right? They don't have built into their genetics, we're all going to fly together in this moment from east to west or north to south, or swim from east to west or north to south. They do it because they're all interconnected through their nearest neighbor. What was constant through this, of course, was the sun. The sun was critical to unify this, and part of the story here has to be that this entire experience played out over the same latitude. If this was a longitudinal experience, the people to the north and the people to the south would have different angles of the sun, but here we have the same relationship from east to west across that Gulf Coast. So I'll just close. I mean, yesterday we talked about the politics of this. We talked about the challenges, the sea level rise, the fact that Miami's going to be underwater by 2050. And what I'm going to do the rest of my life, hopefully got a few more years here, down the hall in that little closet, is I'm going to figure out how to connect that experience that I just told you about with our own futures. And by that I don't mean to say that we're going to go back to a Native American strategy of relocating along meridians and tying into the solstices and so forth, but at least start to think about time in a longer frame, that we don't just plan for the next 10 or 20 years of our future, but the next century or 2 centuries of our future. And that's what I think these Native people did. They were brilliant in dealing with change. It was something that got lost in the Enlightenment. What happened? The age of rational thought? We ended up being such short-sighted people that we can't deal with our own long-term futures the way our native neighbors did here. So maybe it's time to get back to that logic a little bit. It's certainly one that is predicated under a greater respect for balance with nature, and that there's finite limits to what we can actually do as human beings in this world. So thank you for listening. I know I went a little bit long, but I hope you If you guys can indulge a few more minutes, we'll take questions, I guess, huh? Yes, ma'am.
So when you do these triangulations and things, do you try to use any predictive capabilities by saying, oh, here's an intersection or an interesting looking area that we don't know of something yet, we should investigate there?
So that's a good scientific method. So, you know, basically if I can like project out where things ought to have been deposited, like cemeteries or where settlements may have occurred, or substone caches, then, you know, basically it becomes a basis for a hypothesis that it exists at this point. Let's go see. So no, we haven't done that yet, and that would be something that certainly would be necessary in order to make my wild imagination a little bit more than my wild imagination. So to substantiate my ideas, yeah, that would be the hypothesis testing that we need to do, sure. And the same goes with the water. We need to get out to these places that I'm claiming were the original locations of the burials and do coring, and maybe we'd be lucky enough to find some evidence that actually there were people there too. I'm worried that that's it all been churned up by water. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's 100% needs to be done. Yeah. Back here first, I think, and then here, gentlemen. Back here first.
Do modern tribes have any oral traditions dating back to this time? About the people moving and stuff like that?
We had this discussion yesterday. I've actually, I've been a bad anthropologist in not talking to Native people enough, or even at all, because Florida has, we have Seminole and Miccosukee, they're far south in Florida. There's no reason why I couldn't talk to Creek and Cherokee people that have, history in the region and so forth. So that's part of my goal, is to reach out and start looking. You start doing archaeology like this, and you start talking about cosmology and belief systems and so forth. That's where, Western science ends and non-Western belief system begins, and they're very powerful. That it wasn't just ideas people held in their head, but it was the sort of prescriptions that were necessary for engaging practice, for doing things the way that they did. They're connected up. It wasn't just random thoughts. So I need to talk to Native people about that. It's a good point, and I've been remiss to this point not to do that. There's a lot of things that have happened in my midlife that have caused me to be concerned that archaeology needs to be more relevant, and that Native American input in our practice is absolutely necessary. If they would be willing to indulge me. So, yes, sir.
Well, I just this perhaps quite off the topic, but it seems to me, looking at your map of what Florida is going to look like in a few decades, this has
no, I don't. No, I can't. I don't want to say that. Miami's going to be underwater by 2050. I'll tell you that.
Well,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's going to change a lot. It seems like this is going to affect, obviously, the whole Caribbean, Gulf Coast, and
Sure.
quite a bit of dislocation. I mean, I don't know what the implications are in terms of the archaeology, but it's going to be a pretty catastrophic change throughout the area.
I think it's. I mean, if the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet collapses, it will be catastrophic. And it's going to make all prior environmental disasters, at least in the historic era, look like a walk through the park. And the cost are going to eclipse all international conflicts of the last couple of centuries. So, I mean, people are starting to work on the solutions, but they're generally engineering solutions rather than displacement and resettlement. And I think that that's critical too, that we really have to start thinking about inducements to get people away from vulnerable areas before it's disastrous.
These changes are going to happen faster than what the people you're talking about.
Well, the ambient rise that comes from the thermal expansion of water with climate change, with global warming, as well as water being added back into the system from the melt of ice and ice. It's basically gradual. But the collapse stuff could have happened catastrophically in the sense that it'd be mass wasting. It'd be that we're going to get. So there's a geologist in Florida that's done this from the last interglacial at 125,000 years ago. She doesn't have a refined enough chronology, but she's of the opinion that it was something that might have been within the course of a decade, a rise as much as several meters. And if we get that kind of rate, I don't think we can outpace it with engineering, right? So it's probably a good idea to start thinking about real estate speculation in high places like Boulder. You got any room for 5.5 million people from Miami?
Not on Boulder Creek.
Not on Boulder Creek. We got one more. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I understand the solstice angles that you're talking about. What would be the significance of a north meridian to these people?
I wish Steve Lexon was here.
Well, yeah, that's right. He does orient his.
Yeah, the chocolate meridian.
Yeah.
So I was talking, I've known about that argument since he came up with it. I read it right after it was published, and he came around with lectures. He was doing lectures all over the country on rings. I thought it was fascinating. So I don't know if I can give you an adequate answer, but I think a lot of the answer has to do with the belief that directions were emblematic or signified certain forces or powers. So the way that I represent it here, Powder Point, is that north would be the direction of renewal, of rejuvenation, and so forth. And if you think about the sun then, so as it migrates from the south to the north as it rises and sets, it's going from winter to summer. It's going from the dead season to the living season. And then it goes back to the dead season. So the cycle part I haven't really figured out yet, but that direction moving north I think is consistent with the idea that is moving in a direction where food's going to be more plentiful, it's going to be warmer, more hospitable to live. Subtropical Florida is never really a problem. People can, make a living there year round without too much trouble.
A large number of the Indian tribes, the orientation of the villages, and also their cosmology, as we would say, are completely built on northeast, southwest.
Sure. Cardinal directions,
Each
yeah.
does have it in the place of the renewal, the movement, the growth, and in fact, all of those cardinal points are essential points in history, all the way through the American Indian tribes. So it's another area where when you get to talk to them, you will hear all of those.
And I imagine I'm going to hear a lot of variations, though, too, that there's a lot of historically specific circumstances that would make directions have meaning under different circumstances, right?
And yet going through all the books on this, what I found is a hell of a lot of symmetry in the way they thought between northern, southern, eastern, and western.
So, this is the stuff where, the disconnect between 4,000 years ago and the present is going to get in the way. But part of the argument of making this relevant is not worrying about that time as an impediment, thinking about what some people might say is time bending or time folding. We start doing that, it's like science fiction. There's no reason why the experiences of people 4,000 years ago can't bear relevance to our future, not literally, but more metaphorically or figuratively. Ways of thinking about our relationship to the earth and our relationship to time. That we definitely could benefit from being a little more long perspective about it. Yes, ma'am.
Why were they putting the soapstone in there?
Well, that's a good one, and I'm of the belief, I'm pretty convinced. I've been studying soapstone and pottery for 20-some years now. I did my dissertation on the early pottery, and I've been involved in soapstone dating for 20-some years. They did not need the soapstone. The pottery technology was being used directly over fire for direct heat cooking. It's pretty good technology. It's very good technology. It's the oldest in North America. So it was unnecessary. So they were moving this stuff around for reasons other than practical need. So there's a significance to it, and I don't know what it is, but by virtue of the fact that it traces to a different place, a northern place. And in fact, the two lines I showed go to the major sources there. So what might that say is that the medium soapstone referenced or signified other times and places. It became emblematic of being somewhere else. So to have soapstone on the Gulf Coast was to simultaneously be on the Gulf Coast and to be near Atlanta, Georgia area, by virtue of having that thing. Not as a time machine or anything like that, but just emblematically or symbolically.
And the other thing, a little side is, the Clovis, is this the same Clovis as was found up on 6th Street?
Yeah. I mean, it gets generalized. It's the fluted points that date between 13,600 and 12,800, roughly. Did I do okay? Professor Bamforth can answer that question. You got any more or had enough? One more back here.
Is there any evidence of roads between these places?
Oh, I'd love to have that. If I could have Chacoan roads connecting these places up.
Right.
Yeah, unlike parts of the Southwest, most of this area we're talking about here has been plowed and developed. A lot of it developed, not so much, urban environment, but certainly farms, a lot of plowing, a lot of erosion. So any surface evidence for this going back 4,000 years, unfortunately, has probably been erased. And the other thing about it I should note is that these lines, when you start drawing lines, that's when, you worry that people are going to think that you're kind of nuts. Because the lines are, those are just lines on a two-dimensional map. So that's not really accurate, right? But Steve Lexon reminded me the other day, and I've talked to archaeoastronomers about this and so forth. When we talk about these lines, it's not that they're direct lines. They're just broad corridors of direction. So in real space, they might have been a kilometer wide. And so instead of looking for a narrow little road like that, it's really just more like a swath of land in that direction, what lies along it. And I did have an audience member last time I gave this talk to the public saying, well, what about all the spaces in between? And my answer to that is that this is fractal. It occurs at every scale. And that's an easy way out of saying basically, if I ratchet down the triangle small enough, I can account for everything. right? And that's not really fair, but you know, if we actually had complete evidence of everything archaeologically was out there, we could test the spacing and find out how much stuff is clustered, what's going on in between the major clusters and so forth. But like everything else in archaeology, it's like having a puzzle with 1,000 pieces and we only have 28 of them. It's kind of hard to see the big picture there. More than anything else, this is a matter of allowing, this is really the bottom line message here, allowing what has got to be, in my mind, the truth, is that these ancient people did not live by fate alone. They took fate into their own hands, right? So we think we're privileged people after the Enlightenment, that somehow like we've wrested nature into our own control and we can like determine our own fate like nobody's ever done before. That's not true. People have been doing this for millennia and they did it better than we have, perhaps. They certainly have longer shelf life. Yeah, they don't have MTV, they don't have like, you know, nuclear reactors and so forth. But boy, they were able to sustain their traditions way longer than anything the Westerners have. So